Hello class, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about interventions and doing a little bit of an introduction to interventions. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes, some of the things I want to cover, we're going to discuss the criteria for effective interventions and discuss issues, considerations, constraints, ingredients, and processes associated with intervention design. Before we get into it though, I want you to think for a minute. We're going to have opportunity in the online discussion this week to talk about this together, but I want you to think about OD interventions that you've participated in that you would consider successful. What factors do you think contributed to the success of those interventions? Of those that were unsuccessful, why do you think they were unsuccessful? And what are the reasons for unsuccessful interventions based on your experience? I think we often don't actually think about all of the different types of interventions and activities we've been involved in the past. But when you stop and think about it, I think you'll realize that you actually have been involved in many over the course of your work life. And some of them probably were successful, and some of them were probably mediocre, and some of them were probably horrible. So I want you to think about that, noodle on that as we talk about the other slides, and then you can take that thinking with you to the discussion this week. So what are interventions? They're sets of structured activities in which selected organizational units engage in a task or sequence of tasks with the goals of organizational improvement and individual development. Despite some standard practices, no two interventions are alike. And I do want to emphasize here that sometimes big consulting firms will get into the practice of having pre-packaged interventions where they claim they have the secret sauce, that they have figured out how to fix an array of different types of organizational challenges, and all you have to do is purchase this package, and then you'll have someone come who works for the firm, and they'll implement the pre-existing package of intervention for you. I am super skeptical of this approach. For the very reason, as I say at the bottom of the slide, no two interventions are alike because context matters and every organization is different. So even if as a consultant, I've worked with 20 tech companies on similar types of OD issues in the past, that doesn't mean that when another organization is having similar types of symptoms or issues that I can just slap on the same Band-Aid I've done at other places. That is an incredibly problematic approach to doing consulting work, but it's also incredibly common. And so I want you to think critically about that as you think about past experiences you've been a part of, and as you find yourself in opportunities to be involved in interventions in the future. Also think about it in relation to your project. It's good to apply past experience, and it's good to apply best practices that we've seen that work in other places, but that's no substitute for doing original research and trying to understand the particulars of a given context and the issues at hand within a given organization with particular people and different personalities and group dynamics and all of those elements. All right. And interventions, again, broadly speaking, are any set of structured activities. We'll talk more about that in the coming slides. Another definition of interventions: an intervention is a set of sequenced and planned actions or events intended to help the organization increase its effectiveness. Interventions purposely disrupt the status quo. So again, there's discussion here about sequenced planned actions. We're trying to improve the organization, of course, through the interventions. In order for that to happen, though, in order for change to happen, you have to disrupt the status quo. There's always organizational inertia. And people tend to resist change. That's just kind of the common state of human nature. And so if we want to be able to make meaningful change and sustainable change, and we want to have an intervention that can actually have an impact within the organization, then we have to find ways to disrupt the status quo in a way that won't simply raise everyone's resistance, but will create buy-in and increase the opportunities of intervention success in its implementation and follow-up. So why do we do interventions? To prompt change in the client organization. Like I said, we're disrupting the status quo. We're disrupting current practice. and to address one or more dissatisfactory conditions: problems, vision, alignment, structure, policies, practices, culture, attitudes about employee attitudes. There's so many different elements that often need to be addressed within organizations. And so when we see those problems, then we go in and we try to diagnose and we try to understand. We collect data, we analyze the data, we try to figure out how to make improvements. So when do we do interventions? After spending time first understanding, when the data indicates that it's necessary, when the client agrees, and when the organization is ready and able to change. So many people just like to rush in to provide a solution to a problem. They don't, first of all, sometimes the presenting problems aren't the real underlying issues. And so if you see a surface level problem and you rush in to try to solve that surface level problem, you might put a band-aid on it, or what was more likely is you're going to end up playing whack-a-mole, and you're going to do something to address one problem without addressing the underlying issue, and then something else will pop up in another area, and over and over and over again. And so we have to take time to try to understand the challenges and the problems holistically from all angles. And only when we do some of our own research, we've talked about that in recent weeks about the different types of methods we can use. Only once we do our own research do we then put together a proposal. But just because we feel like we understand, and just because we feel like we know what's necessary based on the data, we can't just do it. We have to get the client buy-in. We have to bring them along in the process. We have to communicate with them openly throughout the process and help them feel connected to what we're proposing and buy into what we're proposing, because we can have the best ideas in the world and the best possible solutions, but if we don't sell it to the client, then nothing's ever going to happen. And then sometimes different interventions just simply won't work given the current state and nature of the organization. So sometimes we have to be, always we have to be strategic, but sometimes we have to put off something that seems like an important intervention because the timing's simply not right. So we need to think thoughtfully about all those different pieces. I also want to talk for a minute about intervention strategies versus intervention activities. What I hope that you'll do, and I've referred to this previously in the course, is that you think holistically about total intervention activities combined together into an overarching strategy. So that's what you see here. We have an intervention strategy that includes specific activities. And really, every touch point with the client, from that very first client meeting to doing the needs analysis to working with them on developing a survey, implementing the survey, feeding back the data on the survey, going in, having meetings, doing observations, delivering training, whatever, all those different pieces, those are all discrete activities that should happen within a broader context. Unfortunately, what often happens is that consultants don't have an overarching strategy. A lot of times firms are brought in to do one specific activity. Maybe they are brought in to do an activity for a day or for a weekend, maybe for a couple of weeks. But a lot of times what's actually needed is a sustained series of activities to address different needs of the employees, to break down resistance, to build up the buy-in, and to actually do the implementation, the follow-up, the assessment, and all of those elements. So everything you do with your client is part of the intervention strategy, or should be. And so please think about that. And I know you're in the process of your project, and you can't magically go back in time right now and say, well, wait a minute, I wasn't thinking about this, and this as part of our overall strategy. I get that. I know that. And that's just part of the nature of learning as you're doing in the course. But I hope that as a team, you'll take some time to step back, to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you've done up to this point, perhaps what you would do differently if you were to start over at the beginning of the semester to get to this point midway through the semester. What would you do differently, knowing what you know now in terms of your approach in dealing with your client, intervention strategy, all of those different elements? I think that's a healthy way to go about learning from the process and as you're doing your project. Some characteristics of effective interventions. It's relevant to the needs of the organization. You have to address a real need, not a made-up need, not a need that you pitch to them and try to sell to them so you can also pitch and sell the solution, but like a real need based on valid information where there's free and informed choice from the organization and the employees within the organization, and there's internal commitment. That is when there's relevance of the need to the organization. It's based on causal knowledge of intended outcomes. It should be, but a lot of times these things aren't. Does it transfer competence to manage change to organization members? The client, the consultant's not going to be there forever. So you might be there perhaps even for weeks or months, but eventually you leave and you need to transfer competence to manage the change to people who will stay in the organization. Otherwise, it's simply not sustainable. It doesn't matter how good the intervention was. It doesn't matter how good the materials are, how good the research was that you did. You have to find ways to transfer competence. In terms of selecting intervention, match the intervention to the data and the diagnosis. Make sure clients are ready for the change. Think strategically about where to intervene first. Timing matters. Think about the depth of the intervention. Think about activity sequence, and you can see more details on some of those elements. Ultimately, be thoughtful about how you put together your overarching strategy. Create opportunities for learning throughout the process. So it's not something you go through this whole big long intervention strategy and only at the very tail end, once implementation happens, is there any opportunity for learning and feedback. Learning and feedback should be built in throughout. Give free choice throughout. You don't want to be coercing people to participate because simply that results in bad data, which results in bad interventions. Be clear and explicit about outcomes. And be attentive to the details, be attentive to the logistics, and prepare the client to take on more of a role once you leave, and think about the relationship between you and the client, you as a consultant and the client. Now, just in the last couple of minutes, I'm not even going to go through all these slides, but there's three broad ways that are going to be presented in the coming weeks in terms of how you can categorize interventions. One is individual level interventions, two is team level interventions, and three is organization-wide, whole organization interventions. So the next 3 weeks we'll dive into each of those specifically. But another way to look at it is human process interventions, techno-structural interventions, human resource management interventions, and strategic interventions, with, of course, some overlap between each. So the remaining slides actually go through and provide some examples of what would fit into those 4 different broad categories. So you can review those if you like. And then in the coming weeks, we'll be looking more at individual, team and group level, and whole organization interventions. With that, I hope you enjoy the materials this week, that you have a good week with your team and continue to make progress on your project. And please, as always, let me know if and when you have any questions, and I want to help you as much as I can to be successful, both individually as you understand the material and apply it, but also in your team projects so you can have good experience and good outcomes for the client at the end of the semester. Thanks, everyone.